All right, Jeff, we'll say good morning. Let us begin. Begin by thanking our Talmud Torah sponsors. We're going to give our Talmud Torah sponsors of Nisan one more day, even though it's Rosh Chodesh Iyar, still technically speaking the last day of Nisan. So to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors, for Nisan to thank Steve and Terry Zinn for dedicating all the Shir and Drushos this month with gratitude to Hashem and welcoming their first grandchild, Adin Tzvi Hochbaum, Benjamin and Elys Wohl of Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating the Shir and Drushos with an immense debt of gratitude to all those who help facilitate the dissemination of the Torah, of our Shiurim, beyond the confines of the Beis Midrash, specifically Moishe, Abramson, and Jeremy Lasson, Shimon Bat Shav Messing for dedicating the Shiurim this month in honor of the bas mitzvah of their daughter Laila, Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating the Shir and Drushos this month in memory of Paul's parents, Shmuel ben Zechariah, Leah Bas Abram, and great-grandmother Tyrell Bas Rabdov. And we thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Jack Bennett, in memory of Sergeant Nikolai Rappaport of the Givati Brigade, who was killed in Lebanon in a Hezbollah ambush on February 7th, 1998. We hope that in the merits of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah. Meretz Hashem, the grandchildren, the daughters should continue to give nachas, and the Meretz Hashem, the families, a nechama and nachas. All right, to both say with that, let us begin. So a very exciting day today. Today is our last daf of Maseches Shekalim, and an incredible Gemara ahead of us. So today's daf is Chaf Beis. We are going to pick up 22. We are going to pick up at the Mishnah on the bottom of Chaf Aleph Amud Beis, the Mishnah that is labeled Halacha Gimel. So the Mishnah says as follows. The Mishnah says, Basar Kodshei Kadoshim Shenitma. So both an interesting sugya, which you're actually going to see ties back a little bit to something fascinating we did in Psachim as well. So Basar Kodshei Kadoshim Shenitma, Bein ba'av hatuma, bein bevlad hatuma. So if you have sacrificial meat, which became ritually impure, which became tamei, whether it became tamei with an av or whether it became tamei with a vlad. So let's remember again, we've spoken about these concepts before. Av hatuma means a primary source of tuma, a corpse, a sheretz. A vlad means derivative tuma, means, for example, something that touched an av and then transmits tuma to something else. So the Mishnah says, if you have meat of kodshei kadoshim, whether it became tamei through an av or through a vlad, bein bifnim, bein b'chutz, whether it became tamei inside of the Beis Hamikdash, outside of the Beis Hamikdash, Beis Shammai omrim, hakol yisarif. Bifnim. Beis Shammai says, the way we dispose ultimately again of sacrificial meat is everything is burnt inside of the Beis Hamikdash, chutz mishenitma ba'av hatuma b'chutz. With one exception, if something became ritually impure, something became tamei, with an av hatuma, a primary source of tuma, b'chutz, outside of the Beis Hamikdash, then it is burnt b'chutz. That's the position of Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel omrim, hakol yisarif b'chutz. Beis Hillel says, no, everything that becomes tamei is burned outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Chutz mishenitma bivlat hatuma bifnim, with the exception of something that is rendered tamei with a vlad hatuma inside of the Beis Hamikdash. Top of Chaf Beis, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, shenitma ba'av hatuma bein bifnim bein b'chutz yisarif. Rabbi Eliezer says, you will say, interesting, Rabbi Eliezer is going to say like this: everything is dependent on the type of tuma you are exposed to. So Rabbi Eliezer says, if the item became tamei with an avatuma, primary source of tuma, bein bifnim bein b'chutz, whether you're inside the Beis Hamikdash or outside of the Beis Hamikdash, yisarif b'chutz. Ultimately, again, so I will say anything that becomes tamei with an avatuma is burnt outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Shenitma bevlad hatuma, if something became tamei with a vlad hatuma, bein b'chutz bein bifnim, whether it became tamei b'chutz or bifnim, yisaref bifnim. So this is an interesting shita. So Rabbi Eliezer holds that everything is fundamentally dependent on the nature of the tuma exposure. If you became tamei with an av, then by definition you are burned b'chutz. If you became tamei with a vlad, then by definition you are burned bifnim. And finally, the last shita, we'll say 4 shitas in this Mishnah: Beis Shammai, Beis Hillel, Rabbi Eliezer, now Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Makom tum also sham sreifa. So we'll say perhaps the easiest shita to remember. Rabbi Akiva holds that halacha l'maisa, wherever you become tamei, that's where you are burned. Right? Wherever the item contracts tuma, that's ultimately where it's destroyed. So the item contracts tuma bifnim, ultimately, again, it is burnt bifnim. Item contracts tuma b'chutz, it is burnt b'chutz. So we'll say four-way machlokes about how to dispose of kachek basar, kachek hadoshim, which remember again, Abba, so you've seen this enough to know different levels of Kedusha for sacrificial item. We have kachek hadoshim and kachim kalim, right? So for example, shlamim often fall into the category of kachim kalim. So four machlokes about how to dispose of kachek hadoshim which become tameh. Good. So we'll say let's analyze. Says the Gemara Bosei Chav Beis with Aleph, 4 lines in. Bar Kafra Amar Av HaTumah. So we'll say. So now, interestingly enough, 3 out of the 4 opinions make a distinction between the type of tumah that the kachek hadoshim contracted, whether it's Av or whether it's Vlad. So interestingly enough, Bar Kafra says as follows: Av HaTumah Dvar Torah, Vlad HaTumah Midivrehem. So we'll say a very fascinating sheet. Bar Kafra holds that halacha l'maisa there is a halachic distinction between an avatoma and a vlad hatoma. An avatoma is da'oraisa, a vlad hatoma is dirabanan. Interesting shita. So the Gemara says that's Bar Kafra. Rabbi Yochanan says. Rabbi Yochanan on the other hand says then no. He holds. Amar bein zeh. I'm sorry. Rabbi Yochanan Amar bein zeh Dvar Torah. Rabbi Yochanan holds that both the Av as well as the Vlad are both going to be the Araisa. The Kasha Rabbi Yochanan al the Beis Shammai. The problem, because now what the Gemara is going to do is take this machlokes and try to line it up with the opinions espoused in the Mishnah. And the problem we run into is that the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan seems to go ahead and be contradicted by Beis Shammai. Kasha Rabbi Yochanan Beis Shammai. Why? The Beis Shammai omna kol yisarif bifnim chutz mishinitma ba'av hatuma b'chutz, because Beis Shammai in general holds that any basar kachek kadoshim which become impure ultimately are burned, right? Is destroyed inside of the Beis Hamikdash, with one exception, with kachek kadoshim which became tamei through exposure to an av hatuma outside. So we'll say, so if you became exposed to an av hatuma outside of the Beis Hamikdash, Beis Shammai says we will burn that outside, which I will say, by the way, intuitively, what's the logic of that? Intuitively, if something became tamei outside of the Beis Hamikdash with an avatuma, you're not going to bring it into the Beis Hamikdash in order to go ahead and destroy it. So Beis Shammai, but again, just to be clear, Beis Shammai ultimately is distinguishing between Av and a Vlad. So for example, in Beis Shammai Shita, if kachek kadoshim were to become tamei through a Vlad chatuma outside of the Beis Hamikdash, you would bring it inside in order to destroy it, but yet if it became tamei with an av hatuma outside of the Beis Hamikdash, you would not bring it in. Now this poses a problem according to Rabbi Yochanan. Why? Because according to Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yochanan holds that both an av and the vlad are both d'oraisa, which means that they should not be treated any differently. Says the Gemara, ma bein av hatuma b'chutz, ma bein vlad hatuma b'chutz, zeh v'zeh lo dvar torahu. So we'll say, so again, both are d'oraisa. The fact that they have different names does not change their status. According to Rabbi Yochanan, both Vlad and Av are both Tumah d'oraisa. If that's the case, how do you understand the Shita of Beis Shammai according to Rabbi Yochanan? Again, I will say one more time. If you hold like Beis Shammai, if you hold like Rabbi Yochanan, that both Vlad and Av are both d'oraisa, Beis Shammai held that when kachek kadoshim become tamei through an av b'chutz, you burn it b'chutz. But if it becomes tamei through an av, through a vlad b'chutz, you bring it bifnim. But how does that make sense? If both av and vlad are d'oraisa, they should be treated the same way. To which the Gemara says, "Va'afilu al Beis Hillel lo makasha." The truth is, Rabbi Yochanan Shita is difficult according to Beis Hillel as well. To Beis Hillel Amar hakol yisarif b'chutz chutz ma shenitma bivlad hatuma bifnim. Because Beis Hillel held that all basar kachek kadoshim which become tameim are all burnt outside of the Beis Hamikdash, with one exception, and the exception being vlad hatuma bifnim. So if kachek kadoshim becomes exposed to a vlad hatuma inside of the Beis Hamikdash, you'll burn it inside. But again, according to Rabbi Yochanan, ma bein vlad hatuma bifnim, ma bein av hatuma bifnim. I don't understand. According to Rabbi Yochanan, I will say both vlad as well as Av are both d'oraisas. So I don't understand why there should ever be any distinction about where you're going to destroy the basar kachek kadashim which became tamei. The Gemara says, "Ma bin av hatoma bifnim zev v'zeh lo dvar Torah." Are they not both biblical in nature? To which the Gemara says, "Lo havu ba rabbanon ela al debar kafra." So the truth is, the Gemara says the rabbis didn't really spend that much attention or didn't spend that much time focusing on the shita of Rabbi Yochanan. Rather, they really only focused on the shita of bar kafra. Bar kafra. The Gemara said, but one second, even according to Rabbi Silber, so bar kafra makes a distinction. Bar kafra holds that an av is da'araisa and a vlad is dirabanan. To which the Gemara says, "V'kasha de bar kafra al de beis Shammai." But the truth is, even according to bar kafra, both of these shitos pose a problem. So the Gemara says, "How so?" Watch this. De beis Shammai omrim hakol yisarif bifnim chutz mishenitma ba'af hatuma b'chutz. Because beis Shammai hold that in general all basar kachek kadoshim, which became tamei, is all burnt inside of the Beis Hamikdash, with the exception of something which became tamei ba'av hatuma b'chutz. Ma bein av hatuma bein b'chutz bein bifnim. I don't understand. Why should there be any distinction between av hatuma bifnim b'chutz zev v'zeh lo dvar Torah? Or is it not da'oraisa on both levels? In other words, I will say there should be one din for an avatuma, right? If an avatuma is da'oraisa, so I be mechalik in terms of where the basai kachek kadashim contracted the tuma. So the Gemara says, which the Gemara says, who began Rabbi Akiva da'amar makom tumaso sham tehes reifaso. That's because Beis Shammai is coming to counter the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva holds that in general we never go ahead and wherever the item becomes tamei, that's halacha lamaisa, where you go ahead and destroy it. So Beis Shammai is coming to go ahead and argue on that particular opinion. But the truth is, even bar kafra poses a problem according to Beis Hillel. Va'afilu al de Beis Hillel lo mekasha. But does bar kafra's opinion not pose a problem according to Beis Hillel? After all, what did Beis Hillel say? The Beis Hillel Omer hakol yisaref b'chutz chutz mishenitma bevlat hatoma bifnim. According to Beis Hillel holds that halacha l'maisa, all basar kachei kadoshim which became tamei are burnt outside of the Beis Hamikdash, with one exception. A vlad hatuma bifnim. So if basar kachei kadoshim contracted tuma through a vlad inside of the Beis Hamikdash, you burn it inside of the Beis Hamikdash. But even according to bar kafra, ma bein vlad hatuma bein bifnim bein b'chutz zev v'zeh lo medivreimu. I don't understand. So you're both saying, according to bar kafra, if you hold that an av is a da'oraisa and a vlad is a dirabanan, should that not dictate how they are both dealt with? So I don't understand. What does it matter if the kachek kadashim contracted tuma from the vlad bifnim or b'chutz? The halacha should be the same. To which the Gemara says, no, began to Rabbi Shimon. So ultimately, again, Beis Shammai espouses this particular opinion. Why? Kind of to offset or to counteract or to respond to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. What does Rabbi Shimon say? Amar ma'achalo umashko shamatzora mishtalchin chutz l'shalosh macharos. Because ultimately Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion that halacha l'maisa, both the food and the drink of the mitzora is sent out of the three camps. Now both say, now this is actually very interesting. If you take a look at the Karban Ha'eda, which is the top left. So the top left, right after you see the large wide lines on top, right after those in the short lines, the second short line. Begin Rabbi Shimon, b'shvil hada amar Rabbi Shimon, t'mishalchin afilu ochlin t'mein lochutz, hilchach koma shenitma b'chutz ein mavian oso lifnim. So we'll say, this is very interesting. So the Gemara is suggesting over here that halacha l'maisa Beis Hillel is coming to argue on the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion, which at first glance appears to be a very intuitive opinion, which is whatever becomes tamei outside of the Beis Hamikdash, you don't what? You don't bring it in. You don't bring it in. You never bring it to an. I will say now. What I want to point out, I'm sure you're thinking about this, like as we're doing this sugya, and thinking to yourself, why would anyone ever bring in basar kachei kadoshim, which became tamei, into the Beis Hamikdash? Right? What a strange thing to say. And remember, I just want to point out, according to everyone, there is that possibility, and they're arguing on the mitzias, right? They're arguing about vladatoma, avatoma. So the argument centers around two things, which is the nature of the tumah exposure, and the location of the tumah exposure. So all four opinions will say, depending on the nature and location, that will ultimately determine where you dispose of the meat of the Kodesh Kadoshim. But everyone is agreeing, with the exception of Rabbi Akiva, I should say 3 out of the 4, because Rabbi Akiva holds wherever the meat becomes tameh, that's where you burn it. But the other 3 opinions have the possibility of basar Kodesh Kadoshim becoming tameh outside and bringing it inside to destroy it. Why would you ever bring tumah into the Beis HaMikdash? Because I will say, remember again, this is Kodesh Kadoshim. So because it is sacrificial meat of the highest order of Kedusha, there is a logic to saying that we should bring it into the Beis HaMikdash in order to go ahead and destroy it. Because even when destroying it, perhaps it has to be destroyed in a certain bakavadik way. See, interestingly enough, there is an opinion of Rabbi Shimon. And Rabbi Shimon holds that in general, halacha l'maisa, we don't bring tamei things into the Beis HaMikdash. If something became tamei in the Beis HaMikdash, okay, perhaps one could make the argument to destroy it in the Beis HaMikdash. But if it became tamei outside of the Beis HaMikdash, we never bring it in. Now, where does Rabbi Shimon say this? So again, back to the Korbanos, but Rabbi Shimon says this apparently by Mitzora. So the Korbanos writes, B'shil Hadam Rabbi Shimon, the Mishalchin afilu ochlin tamein chluchutz. The Rabbi say, even when it comes to ritually impure food, we send that outside of the camp, which means, again, it's certainly outside of the Beis HaMikdash. Hilchach, komash nitma b'chutz, ein mevi'in oso lifnim. Therefore, anything which by definition became tamei outside of the Beis HaMikdash, we do not bring it into the Beis HaMikdash. Therefore, again, Beis Hillel is espousing their shita that they disagree, and they say, no, under certain circumstances, halacha l'maisa, you could even bring that which is tamei into the Beis HaMikdash for disposal purposes. So we'll say, so 4-way machlokes about how to go ahead and dispose of basar kodesh kadoshim, which become tamei. We'll say, halacha l'maisa, how do we paskin? So the Rambam, this is in the Hilchos Psulei HaMukdashin, Perek Yutes, Pasuk Vav. Now, both say this is actually a very exciting Rambam. You know, sometimes it's very exciting when you see different things that you've learned in different places kind of coalesce into one location. So you're going to hear a very familiar halacha. So the Rambam paskins as follows: Basar kodesh kadoshim shenitma bifnim, sarfin oso bifnim, vim nitma bachutz, sarfin oso bachutz. So both say halacha l'maisa, we paskin like Rabbi Akiva. Last opinion in the Mishnah. Wherever you become tamei, wherever the basar kodesh kadoshim becomes tamei, that's where it is disposed of. It becomes tamei inside of the Beis HaMikdash, destroyed inside. Becomes tamei outside of the Beis HaMikdash, destroyed outside. The Rabbi say, this is going to sound familiar. Bein shenitma ba'avatuma, bein shenitma b'vlad. And the Rambam says we're not mechalik between an avatuma and a vlad in terms of kodesh kadosh. Now, of course, in other areas of tumah, we are absolutely mechalik between an av and a vlad, because remember again, the ability of an av versus a vlad to transmit tumah is going to be fundamentally different. But at least for this purpose over here, wherever you contract the tumah, that is where you are destroyed. Now, interestingly enough, he says, I'll skip down a little bit. Lo nimnu, this is not a sugya, but it's very exciting that it's here. Umiyemem shakohanim lo nimnu mi lisrof es habasar shenitma ba'av hatoma shahari hu rishon latoma im habasar shenitma bevlad hatoma. Does this sound familiar? We had this in Psachim. You remember this sugya in Psachim where there was a discussion about if you have to burn sacrificial meat because it's tamei, but you have meat that's different levels of tumah. So when we had a discussion, can you burn a rishon with a sheni? Or can you burn a rishon with a shlishi? Because remember again, what happens if you burn a rishon with a shlishi? What do you do? What's happening over here? You're essentially making the shlishi into a sheni. So the shaila is you're being mar betuma. Are you allowed to do that in the course of the destruction of Korbanos, the sacrificial matter? And remember again, we learned over there the answer is yes. We don't. Once you're destroying it, it doesn't really matter to us what's happening with it. And it just happens to be that is once again espoused in this halacha. But again, we'll say for our purposes, the part to remember is we pass like Rabbi Akiva, wherever you contract the tumah, that is where ultimately the basar kodesh kadoshim is destroyed. Incredible. We'll say here we go weiter. Mishnah, last Mishnah of the Masechta. Incredible Mishnah. Evari hatamid. Ivari atamid nisnin mechatzi kevesh ulamata. So we'll say, interestingly enough, remember, we often have this idea in our minds that Korbanos were shechted, animals were shechted, and they were just immediately offered up. But remember, again, that's actually not the way it worked. Specifically, again, with the Korban Tamid, there was the shechita, the preparation, then they would place the limbs on the ramp, right? Ultimately on the kevesh, on the ramp of the Mizbeach, and then they would go and do a couple of other things. In the morning, they would daven, right? And they would go do a couple of things, and then afterwards, they would come and offer up the limbs on the top of the Mizbeach. So the Mishnah over here is highlighting where they would place the various sacrificial parts. So Ivari HaTamid, so the limbs of the Korban Tamid, Nisnin Mechatzi Kevesh Ulamata. They were placed kind of midway of the ramp, a little bit downward, or slanted a bit towards the bottom, B'marav, towards the west. Shal Musafin, so the sacrificial parts of the Korban Musaf, Nisnin Mechatzi Kevesh Ulamata B'mizrach, they are placed halfway point of the ramp, up the ramp, again, but a little bit downward, a little bit towards the beginning of the ramp, in the east, B'mizrach. Shorosh Kadashim, the sacrificial parts, what's it incredible, right? Sacrificial parts of the Rosh Chodesh. Incredible, Rabbi say. Incredible. So Rosh Chodesh, Rabbi say there's an incredible idea. This is why, we try to be very makbid to recite Korbanos every morning, right? Because the Mishnah Berurah brings down that in the absence of the Beis Hamikdash, when you say Korbanos, at least to say the Parshas HaTamid, it's uneshama parim sivasenu. There's the ability to fulfill the mitzvah of Korbanos to the recitation of Psukim. That's why a person says the Parshas HaTamid, person says Parshas HaKetores, a person says Ezehu Mekolman. When the Beis Hamikdash was standing, you can't offer up every single Korban every single day. But yet, if you say the Parshas of Korbanos every single morning, you have the great schos to offer up all of the Korbanos each and every day. It's a strange anomaly how sometimes when you're missing something, you have the ability to do more than when you actually had it. An incredible schos that we shouldn't miss out on each and every day. See here, and again on Rosh Chodesh, so we add in the supplemental paragraph right before Ezum Makoman of the Rosh Chodesh, of the Korbanos of Rosh Chodesh. So here again, partial kimun l'shama parim sfaseinu. Shorosh Chadashim nitin ar karkov hamizbeach milamalon. So what's very interesting? The limbs of the Rosh Chodesh were placed on the karkov. Now, we already mentioned the karkov in last week's daf. We'll see it again. Gemara is going to say it, but I'll just tell it to you now. The karkov was the area in between the horns of the Mizbeach. Remember again, the top of the Mizbeach, the top surface of the Mizbeach was flat, but at each of the corners it had what's called a horn, a keren, a protrusion. The karkov was like the area in between the horns. That's where the Kohen would walk around the Mizbeach. So the Rosh Chadashim were put on the karkov milamalon. Hashkalim v'abikurim, both say fascinating sugya. Hashkalim v'abikurim, einon noagin ela bifnei habayis. Shkalim, machzis a shekel, bikurim, first fruits, only apply when there is a Beis Hamikdash. Now, both say, if you take a look at the Korban Ha'ida, once again on the left side, he says something very interesting. Why is it that bikurim and machzis a shekel only apply by the Beis Hamikdash? Writes the Korban Ha'ida, Shekalim mishum de tzarach karbaninu, v'cheivan shein karban ein shekalim. Both say, so machzis shekel makes sense. Why is there no machzis shekel when there's no Beis Hamikdash? Because halacha l'maisa, machzis shekel was to purchase karbanos tzibor. If there's no Beis Hamikdash, there's no karbanos, then halacha l'maisa, there's no machzis shekel. What about bikurim? Ubikurim dichsev reishis bikuri admascha tavi beis Hashem elokecha. Bizman sheyesh bayis yesh bikurim ein bayis im karbosa, because the mitzvah of bikurim is explicitly linked to the Beis Hamikdash. It says, you shall bring your bikurim to the Beis Hamikdash. When there is a Beis Hamikdash, there is bikurim. No Beis Hamikdash, no bikurim. So the Gemara says, meiser dagon, meiser behema, ubechoros. But the din of meiser, right? Meiser of your produce, meiser of your animals, bechoros, the din of bechor, noagin bein bifnei habayis, bein shel bifnei habayis. They apply when there is a Beis Hamikdash and when there's not a Beis Hamikdash. Shekalim ubikurim, harei ze kodesh. That was very interesting. Then the Mishnah seems to indicate that shekalim and bikurim have the ability to become kodesh. Rabbi Shimon Omer, ha'omer bikurim kodesh einon kodesh. Rabbi Shimon says, no, if you try to sanctify bikurim bazman hazeh, ultimately, again, it doesn't work. Which Rabbi say sounds like what? Sounds like, but if you did try to sanctify Machzas Shekel, what would happen? It would work. So again, we'll discuss this in the Gemara in just a moment. To which the Gemara says, Ezu Karkov. Rabbi says, remember again, the Mishnah said that the Korbanos of Rosh Chodesh, the sacrificial parts, were placed on the Karkov. Asks the Gemara, what's the Karkov? Ezu Karkov. Ezu Karkov Mizbech. First wide line, Chav Beis with Aleph. Amma bein Karen le Karen makom hiloch raglei kohanim. It is the Amma space in between one horn and the next. That's the area where the Kohanim would go ahead and walk around the Mizbeach. Musvei Shabbos, Musvei Rosh Chodesh Mikodem. So we'll see an interesting discussion now. What about the Karban Musaf of Shabbos, Karban Musaf of Rosh Chodesh? Which one is offered first? So again, Rosh Chodesh falls down on Shabbos. Which Karban should you offer first? We'll say fascinating. Rabbi Yirmiyah Savar Meimar, Musvei Shabbos, Musvei Rosh Chodesh, Musvei Rosh Chodesh Kodmin. Rabbi Yirmiyah says, when you have Shabbos, Rosh Chodesh, the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh is offered first. Now, where does he know that? From Chayle Rabbi Yirmiyah. Rabbi Yirmiyah's proof is Min Hadah, from the following statement: Shiro Shel Shabbos v'Shiro Shel Rosh Chodesh, Shiro Shel Rosh Chodesh Kodem. Because we'll say everyone knows that the Shira of the Leviim, right? When it was Shabbos Rosh Chodesh, there would be two songs the Leviim would sing: the Shira of Rosh Chodesh and the Shira of Shabbos. And it was documented that the Shira of Rosh Chodesh would always go first. Therefore, Rabbi Yirmiyah holds the same way that the Shira of the Leviim for Rosh Chodesh would be first, so to what? The Karban of Rosh Chodesh would also be offered first. Or the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh would be offered first. Rabbi Yosef says not necessarily. Shanya hi tamam Rabbi Chia b'shem Rabbi Yochanan kedei lefarsima olo dio shehu Rosh Chodesh. The only reason why the Shira of Rosh Chodesh came before the Shira of Shabbos, Rabbi said, was why? To publicize to the people that it was Rosh Chodesh. Right? That meaning everybody knows it's Shabbos. The only reason they put the Shira of Rosh Chodesh first was to publicize that it was Rosh Chodesh. However, when it comes to the Karban, listen to this. So the Gemara says, Keitzad haya osa shochet musvei Shabbos v'omer aleyan Shiro shel Rosh Chodesh. We'll say, interestingly enough, but it appears that although they would sing the Shira of Rosh Chodesh first, they would in fact shecht the Musaf of Shabbos first. They would shecht the Musaf of Shabbos, and interestingly enough, sing the Shira of Rosh Chodesh on the Musaf of Shabbos. But why shecht the Musaf of Shabbos first? Baram Hacha, Musaf Shabbos or Musaf Rosh Chodesh, Musaf Shabbos Kodmin, Al Shem, Kol HaTadir Mechaveiro, Kodem Es Chavero. So we'll say same principle espoused by the Bavli, just articulated a little bit differently. In Bavli, it's Tadir B'She'ino Tadir Tadir Kodem. In Yerushalmi, it's Kala Tadir Mechavero, Kodem Es Chavero, but same principle. When you have two mitzvahs to perform, and you're not sure which one to do first, you look at the one which occurs with greater frequency, and that goes first. Since obviously the Musaf of Shabbos is offered more frequently than the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh, therefore, the Musaf of Shabbos is offered first. So we'll say fascinating halacha, which tells me that the Shira of Rosh Chodesh is actually sung before the Shira of Shabbos. But that's for a different reason. That's in order to make sure everybody knows that it's Rosh Chodesh. But the Musaf of Shabbos is offered up before the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh because Tadir B'Sheno Tadir Kodim. Incredible. What you will say, there's an incredible Musaf in that as well. What does it mean that the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh is sung before the Musaf? That the Musaf of Shabbos is sung before the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh. Which Shabbos represents is the ability to go ahead and connect with one's personal Kedusha. Right? That's what Shabbos is all about. Shabbos is I withdraw from the world in order to go ahead and re-energize myself, in order to tap into my own personalistic wellspring of holiness. What's Rosh Chodesh? We'll say, Rosh Chodeshim li'amcha nasata. The beauty of Rosh Chodesh is the energy we feel today, even at this early hour of the morning. It's new beginnings. It's a new month, new beginning, new opportunity. I can make something new of myself. But the Musaf of Shabbos, the Musaf of Shabbos always comes before the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh. Because if you want to take advantage of the new beginnings of life, you must first tap into your personalistic holiness. The new beginnings of life are only meaningful if you have something to begin again with. But if I don't take the time to access my personal Kedusha, if I don't take the time to develop myself, if I don't take the time to become the best version of me, you could have all the new beginnings in the world, but what do you do with them? So the Gemara therefore says, Halacha l'maisa, the Musaf of Shabbos always comes before the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh. You want to take advantage of Rosh Chodesh, of Rosh Chadashim, Yam Chorasata, new beginning, new opportunities. Tap into your personalistic Kedusha of Shabbos first. Says the Gemara, Shekalim Bikurim. So we'll say fascinating sugya. So Shekalim and Bikurim. So Hashkalim Kacha. So we'll say it's interesting because the Mishnah ends off by saying that halacha l'maaseh, if you consecrate Bikurim today, so they are not consecrated. But yet, it seems to be, the inference from that is that halacha l'maaseh, if you were to consecrate Shekalim, they would be consecrated. So the Gemara says, Hashkalim Kachu. Rabbi Shimon Yehuda Mishra Rabbi Shimon Bein Elu Lo Kitchu. No, whether you try to consecrate Shekalim or Bikurim today, it doesn't work because both are fundamentally tethered to the Beis Hamikdash, and in the acts of the Beis Hamikdash, no Bikurim Lamachzeh Shekel. Tani, we'll say this is fascinating. Ger Bizman Hazeh Tzarich Lahavi Kino Revius Keser. We'll say a ger. A person converts today, he has to bring a carbon. Now, if you take a look at the Korban Ha'ida, he says as follows: Ger Bizman Hazeh. So the Korban Ha'ida writes, left-hand side, Afagav Deleka Mikdash, even though there's no Beis HaMikdash, Tzarech Sheyafish Rova Dinar Likino. He has to separate out a quarter of a dinar for his bird offering. So we'll say a ger has to go ahead and bring a carbon when he converts. So what the Gemara is saying now is, and we'll say this is all modeled after the Gerus by Har Sinai. Right? By Har Sinai, there were three things that happened. There was carbon, milah, tvila. Those are the three things, right? Sacrificial offering, circumcision, immersion. So too, when a ger converts today, those three things are necessary. What Rabbi Shimon is saying is that now, even in the absence of the Beis Hamikdash, when a person converts, he must actively set it, or she must actively set aside the money for their carbon, even though the carbon can't be offered. The Korban Ha'ida finishes, and again, so the ger will set aside the money, has to keep the money safe, and when the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt, the ger will bring his or her carbon. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai stopped this practice because it creates a stumbling block. What's a stumbling block? You can't have sacrificial money laying around. Because what happens if you have sacrificial money laying around? You're going to inevitably use it, you're just inadvertently use it for something else. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai felt it's a very bad idea to have sacrificial money laying around. Therefore, again, when a person converts, when the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt, they're going to have to go ahead and bring a carbon, but they should not actively separate out money for it. What does it mean because of the stumbling block? In makdishin, v'lo ma'arichin, v'lo machrimin, v'lo magbiyin shumas ha'maisros b'zman hazeh. So we'll say today, we don't consecrate anything. We don't make anything the subject of an erech vow or a cherim vow, which is when you pledge things to the Beis Hamikdash. This is a different discussion, obviously at odds with our Mishnah. We don't separate out Shumas HaMaestros. And if you indeed were makdish something, let's say today, you consecrated something. You made something hekdesh to the Beis Hamikdash, or something the subject of an erech vow, or a cherim vow, oig bia. So the Gemara says, oig bia, haksus tisarif. If you, let's say, went ahead and consecrated a particular article of clothing, you should burn it. Habehema te'aker, and an animal should be uprooted. How do you uproot the animal? Keitza noah befaneh hadeles yimesemela. You lock it away, and essentially it starves to death. Vamos, and if you separated out money, yilchu liyamamelach. You have to throw the money to the Yamelach, which also indicates to us what? That we don't consecrate things. Don't consecrate things. And if you do consecrate something, the halacha says you have to dispose of it as quickly as possible out of a concern that you may come to misuse it. Avar vehekdesh min ma, Don Reb Shimon, bit Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai ne'atakala, hada amra avar vehekdesh kacha. Now both say, so now I understand that halacha lamaisa, a ger, we're focusing now on the ger, that a ger should not go ahead and separate out the quarter of the dinar for his carbon, right? But let's say he did. Let's say he did it. He shouldn't do it. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says it's a stumbling block. But let's say he did it. It seems to be clear that halacha l'maisa, since Rabbi Yochanan said don't do it because it's a stumbling block, that if you did do it, what's the status of the money? It works. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yuda antudaria baikumi Rabbi Yossi, Hacha at amar amades, hacha at amar kacho, v'hacha at amar lo kacho. But I don't understand. So then why do you make a distinction between machzas shekel and the money for the carbon of the ger? So, right, you're telling me that essentially the ger should not consecrate money for his carbon. But if he did it, it works. Yet, if a person, it sounds like from the Mishnah, that if a person is makdish a machzas shekel, it doesn't work. But why? In other words, it should be the same thing. I will say, obviously, a ger also can't offer. I understand machzas shekel is tethered to the Beis Hamikdash, but guess what? So is the carbon of the ger, right? So if you're going to tell me that a ger shouldn't consecrate money for his carbon, because there's a stumbling block, because he may come to misuse it. But if he did it, it works. So shouldn't that be the same halacha of machzas shekel? You shouldn't consecrate a machzas shekel, but if you did so, it works. Amar le tamon lekach in makdishin lechatchila lefi shemitzvah lahakri mitruma chadasha. See, I both say there's a different reason why a person should not be makdish a machzas shekel today. Why? Because what are you going to do with it? Like, think about this just a moment. The Beis Midrash is going to be rebuilt. You're going to have your machzas shekel. So I both say that works fine if you're makdish your machzas shekel now, and haluvai the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt between this Nisan and next Nisan. But let's say Beis Hamikdash is built a little bit later. What's going to be the status of your machzas shekel? Right, what we call Tiklin Atikin, old Shekalim. Right, what's going to happen? Because the mitzvah is to offer up their Korbanos from the new collection, the Yeshana. And this machzas shekel that you separated out is going to be quote unquote an old shekel, and halacha l'maisa is not usable. So I'll say, interestingly enough, this concept of only having new money is, interesting enough, only a din by machzas shekel, but it is not a din by other korbanos. So you're right, technically speaking, we don't want the ger to separate out money for his carbon. But if he did so, does it work? Does it work? Yeah, technically it works. Technically it works because there's no such thing as new money or old money by the carbon of the ger. But when it comes ultimately to the machzas shekel, one has to ask themselves of just the fundamental effectiveness of such a designation. If the Beis Hamikdash is delayed past the calendrical year, when I say calendrical year, Nisan to Nisan, in which you separated out the shekel. Hekdesh kadosh. So once again, the Gemara said, I don't understand. If I'm makdish a machzas shekel, why don't you just say it's consecrated and let it sit until the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt? To which the Gemara says, Shema yibana habayis keberishona, v'tetarim mechumas halishka mina chadasha bizmana ve'echad benisan. Because maybe when the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt, here both say, we don't know what some of the processes are going to be when the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt. So how is machzas shekel going to work in the third bayis? Who knows? But maybe it'll work the same way like it worked in the first two, in which case, again, shekalim are used from the new collection. And if you separated out your machzas shekel already, while that's very nice, that's going to fall into Tiklin Atikin, old shekalim, and not going to be totally usable, or not going to be usable for the purposes you want to use it. V'hai my islacha. But again, I will say, so the Gemara is just contrasting. So let's be clear. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, don't separate out anything sacrificial. Don't do it. Don't do it. Why? Because we don't want you having consecrated things lying around your house, because you may come to inadvertently use it. Now, from that statement, it sounds pretty clear that according to Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, you shouldn't do it, but if you did it, what? If you did it, what? It works. It works. To which the Gemara says, but interestingly enough, why would it work by ger and not work by machzas shekel? To which the Gemara essentially says, because by machzas shekel there's a din of new shekalim. There's a din ultimate. The real effectiveness of machzas shekel is when it's a quote unquote new shekel, tiklin chadatin, not tiklin atikin. But by the kino shel ger, but by the border offering or the money for the ger, halacha l'maisa, there's no real new or old timing issue. Okay, so the Gemara says, halacha kareb Shimon. And we'll say ultimately again, the Gemara ends off by saying that the halacha indeed follows Reb Shimon. And I will say, remember again, Reb Shimon was in the Mishnah who seemed to indicate that halacha l'maisa, although you can't be makdish bikurim bizman hazeh, ultimately again you can be makdish shekel bizman hazeh. So we'll say, let me just tell you the halacha l'maisa with this. So first of all, the Rambam paskin in Hilchos Shekalim Perek Aleph halacha ches, hashkalim eino noagin ela b'fnei habayis. Number one, Matzah Shekel only applies when there's a Beis Hamikdash. Okay, that we'll say that makes sense. Ubizmash Beis Hamikdash Kayim, fine. The Rambam then goes on to say, by the way, but when the Beis Hamikdash did stand, the halacha of Matzah Shekel applies in Chutz La'aretz as well as in Eretz Yisrael. Interesting that all Jews gave Matzah Shekel, which makes sense because Matzah Shekel ultimately again was there to give everyone a portion in Korbanos Tzibur. So of course, whether you live in Eretz Yisrael or you live in Chutz La'aretz, everybody wants to have a portion in that. So I will say, that is the halacha l'maisa. Matzah Shekel only applies when the Beis Hamikdash stands. I will say, but what happens if halacha l'maisa? What happens today? You're so inspired by learning by Nisayim Shekalim. You're so inspired by finishing a Masechta Yerushalmi that you want to do something substantive, and you say, you know what? I want to be Makdish Matzah Shekel. So Mashiach Emir Hashem comes Mihira B'Yameinu. I'm ready to go. What's the status of that consecration? So here the Rabbi Mamrai says in the Hilchos Erechin, Perek Vov, Halacha Tezayin, Hamakdish Shiklo Lebedek Habayis, Harei Zakodesh. I will say, if you did it, it works. If you did it, it works. If you're Makdish in Matzah Shekel today, it absolutely works. Now again, should you do it? Should you do it? Absolutely not. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, please don't do it, because it is going to create a stumbling block. But if halacha l'maaseh you did do it, it works. Conversely, Hekdesh bikurim lebedek habayis in on Kodesh. I will say, but halacha l'maaseh, for example, today, if you try to makdish bikurim, it would not work. So there's a very interesting distinction. So again, you shouldn't be makdish Matzah Shekel, but if you did so, halacha l'maaseh, it works. So I will say, what about the din of the ger? So interestingly enough, so many good halachas over here. So interestingly enough, the din of the ger, I'll just give you this Mara Mokim, we'll take a look at it. The Rambam in Hilchos Isurei Bia, Perek Yud Gimel, Halachos Dalin and Hay, discusses the entire process ultimately again for the ger. So he writes over here, Mao Karban Ager. So again, he goes to the carbon of the ger. Ubizman Hazeh She'in Sham Karban. But today, where the ger can't offer up a carbon, what's the halacha? Tzarech Mila Utvila. He has to go and do bris Mila, Tvila. And when the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt, the ger will build his carbon. The Rambam then goes on to explain, ger, don't separate out your money for your carbon. It's okay, you're good for, let's say, look, the reality is, when the Beis Hamikdash is rebuilt, there's going to be a huge queue for Korbanos, right? Because this one has to bring a chatas, this one has to bring a toad. So ger is going to have to bring an additional carbon along with everyone else bringing their Korbanos. But halacha l'maaseh, don't separate out the money. So therefore, I'll say halacha l'maaseh we paskin that the mitzvah of Shekalim does not apply when there is not a Beis Hamikdash. But amazingly enough, if you were makdish your Shekalim, halacha l'maaseh it works. However, don't do it. Also, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, ultimately again out of the concern for takala. So I will say this marks the conclusion ultimately of Masechah Shekalim. And I just want to mention very, very quickly in the minute that we have left four takeaway lessons, because this was not an easy Masechta. This was not, you might have noticed, it was not short but not easy. But I will say 4 amazing takeaway messages that we take with us from this Masechta. Number 1, everyone counts. Everyone counts. The whole Yisod of Matzah Shekel was that you take a Matzah Shekel from every single person. To teach us every person counts. So often in life, we assume that some people count, some people don't count, some people count more, some people count less. Matzah Shekel teaches us that every single Yid, every single Jew is so incredibly important. Lesson number 2, it's never too late. Even if you miss your Matzah Shekel, I remember again, let's say I forgot to give Matzah Shekel last year. So what's the halacha? Remember again, little Chazar, what's the halacha? What's the halacha? You bring it. It goes into a different pot called Tiklin Atikin, old Shekalim. It's never too late. Sometimes in life we miss opportunities. And it's true, doors close. And sometimes once doors close, you cannot reopen them. But sometimes doors close, you can't open the old ones, but you could always open new ones. It's never too late in life. Even if I've schluffed through life, even if I've missed opportunity after opportunity, especially now it's so poignant, we're finishing on Rosh Chodesh, new beginnings, it's never too late. If you missed your Tiklin Chadatin, take advantage of your Tiklin Atikin. Number 3, it is a privilege to serve your community. We'll see, we learned this from the Mochre Ophos. Remember again, those who get the bird contract with the Beis Hamikdash. Shabbos say, what happens again? A coin falls in between 2 things, right? And we don't know where the coin is. So Shabbos say, who has to make up the difference? Or birds fly away. So who gets to make up the difference? Who is that? The guy who got the bird contract. He's taking a loss. Because Shabbos say, It's a privilege to be part of a community. It's a privilege to be part of the Kehillah. It's a privilege to be part of a nation. And it's a privilege to serve in that capacity. So often in life, we're called upon to do things. And we're like, I have so much stuff going on. I have to do this, I have to do that, I have to do this. Just remember the Moche Ophos. The Moche was supposed to take a financial loss in order to go ahead and serve in the Beis HaMikdash. Because being part of a community, serving that community, giving to that community, both in the form of your resources as well as the form of your time, is the greatest zuchus, because you are helping to build Klal Yisrael. And lesson number 4, Abosai, Yad Hekdesh al Haelyonah, one of my favorites. Remember again, we saw this where Yad Hekdesh al Haelyonah means what Abosai? That whenever, remember we saw this by the arranging of the contracts, right? If there's any price fluctuations, so what happens? The Beis HaMikdash always benefits. If the price goes up, Beis HaMikdash keeps the low price. If the price goes down, Beis HaMikdash renegotiates. Remember that phrase, Yad Hekdesh al Haelyonah, which means that when you pursue a life of Kedusha, Yado al Haelyonah, you will always benefit. Yad Hekdesh al Haelyonah, when you pursue Hekdesh, when you pursue Chodesh, when you pursue holiness in life, you will always come out ahead. I will say it was an incredible schos to learn Masech Shekalim with all of you. Amir Hashem, siyum information to be announced. And again, Amir Hashem b'shat tov u'metzlachos. On the first day of Rosh Chodesh, we have the great schos to begin Maseches Yuma. It's going to be an incredible and overwhelming and beautiful journey. We should be zocha to finish many more Masechtos together in Halavai. We should be zocha to give our machzas a shekel on the third base of Rabbi Yameinu. Amen.